Assyrian and Babylonian rule. Judah was left the sole heir of the legacy of David and Solomon. 686 BCE, lured by promises of Egyptian aid, attempted to resist Assyria but was defeated and compelled to pay a crushing tribute. It is possible that only the timely intervention of an epidemic that decimated the Assyrian army of Sennacherib saved Judah from total devastation. The eloquent guidance of the prophet Isaiah restored the morale of the people, and even the weakness of Hezekiah's son Manasseh did not bring complete ruin. Another strong king, Josiah, 640 to 609 BCE, arose in time to restore the ebbing fortunes of Judah for a few years, during which much of the ancient territory of United Israel was brought back under the rule of the Davidic dynasty. Assyria was rapidly declining in power, and in 612 its hated capital, Nineveh, was destroyed by the Medes. Josiah's successful rebellion ended when he fell in battle against a more powerful contender for the Assyrian succession, Necho of Egypt. Meanwhile, the Chaldean kings of Babylonia were rapidly gaining strength. Nabopolassar of Babylon and Cyaxares of Media divided the old Assyrian Empire between them, and the former's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, gained control of Syria and Palestine in swift campaigns. The defeated Egyptians, however, continued to intrigue in Palestine, whose native states repeatedly joined anti-Babylonian coalitions, all of which collapsed to themselves or were crushed by the Chaldean armies. Jerusalem was twice besieged, in 597 after 589. Finally, about 587–586, it was stormed and destroyed. The prophet Jeremiah, who had foreseen the tragic denouement and had repeatedly warned his people against their suicidal policy, died in Egypt. Judah was devastated and almost depopulated. The Persian Empire. In 539 BCE, Cyrus II of the Persian Achaemenian dynasty followed up his triumph over Media by conquering Lydia and Babylonia, thus making himself ruler of the greatest empire hitherto known. In the administrative reforms implemented by Darius I, reigned 522 to 486 BCE, Phoenicia, Palestine, Syria, and Cyprus constituted the fifth province, satrapy, of the Persian Empire. One of Cyrus's first acts was to decree, 538 BCE, that Judah be restored and the Temple of Jerusalem be rebuilt. A large number of Jewish exiles in Babylonia returned to Jerusalem, and work on the Second Temple was begun. The political situation was extremely unfavorable, however, since Judah south of Hebron had been occupied by Edomites escaping from Arab pressure, while the tiny remainder north of Hebron had passed under the control of the governor of Samaria. In spite of political intrigues to prevent completion of the work of rebuilding the temple, the Jews took advantage of the civil wars and rebellions that racked the empire after the accession of Darius I to press forward with the work. They were urged on by the fiery prophets Haggai and Zechariah. In 515 BCE the Second Temple was finished, but the Jews had meanwhile aroused the suspicion of the Persian authorities, and further efforts to improve their situation were discouraged. Matters rested in this unsatisfactory state until about 445 BCE, when the Jewish royal favorite, Nehemiah, deeply stirred by reports of the sorry condition of Judah and Jerusalem, succeeded in obtaining the Persian ruler's support for a mission to Palestine. Under Nehemiah's leadership, Jerusalem's walls were rebuilt. Knowledge of the exact sequence of events is complicated by the confused state of the documentary sources, and the chronology of events in the time of Nehemiah and Ezra. Who became a leader of the Jews who had returned to Jerusalem from Babylonia, is not certain. There is good evidence to suggest that Ezra's return to Jerusalem should be dated to 398 BCE, early in the reign of the Persian king Artaxerxes II. The mention of Persian intervention in the priestly affairs of the high priest Yohanan can reasonably be associated with Ezra's reform activities. In any event, Nehemiah and Ezra were able to establish both the religious autonomy of Judah and the practice of normative Judaism so firmly that they continued with little change for several centuries. Information concerning the history of Palestine in the period following the age of Nehemiah and Ezra is scanty. It is known that the province of Judah continued to be administered by high priests who struck their own coins, and that the provinces of Samaria and Ammon remained under governors of the houses of Sanballat and Tobiah. In 343 Artaxerxes III, Ochus is said to have devastated parts of Palestine in connection with his reconquest of Egypt. 11 years later, the country passed into Macedonian hands after Alexander the Great's conquest of Phoenicia. From Alexander the Great to 70 CE. To Alexander, Palestine was, as to many before him, a corridor leading to Egypt, the outlying Persian province. Consequently, in his attack on that province after the Battle of Issus, he confined his attention, in his passage southward, to reducing the coastal cities that might form bases for the Persian fleet. He left the Jews undisturbed in their religion and customs. The high priest remained the head of the Jewish state, perhaps assisted by a council of elders. See Ancient Greek Civilization, Alexander the Great and Hellenistic Age. The Ptolemies. After the death of Alexander in 323 BCE, Palestine, with much of Syria and Phoenicia, fell to Ptolemy I, Soter, who established himself as satrap in Egypt that same year and adopted the title of king by 304. After the death of Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for 300 years. The successors of Alexander, including Ptolemy and Seleucus I, Nicator, defeated Antigonus I, Monothelmus, another of Alexander's generals, who had almost succeeded in recreating under his sole rule Alexander's vast empire, at the Battle of Ipsus in Phrygia in 301 BCE. This victory confirmed Ptolemy in his possession of his territory, although he had arrived too late for the battle, and Seleucus, whose participation in it had been decisive, at first disputed Ptolemy's claim to Syria and Phoenicia and actually occupied northern Syria. This early dispute laid the foundations of a century of bitter antagonism between the houses of Ptolemy and Seleucus. That led to war 5 times, the so-called Syrian Wars, and was finally stilled only when Palestine, in 200 BCE, became part of the Seleucid kingdom. The northern boundary of the kingdom established by Ptolemy lay apparently slightly north of modern Tripoli, Lebanon, perhaps on the course of the Kabir River, ancient Eleutherus. And there are no signs of any important change in this frontier throughout the next century. Of Ptolemaic rule in the southern part of this territory, Palestine, little is known. The small amount of information there is, mainly from writers of a later period, especially the author of the first book of Maccabees and the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, suggests that, unlike the northern region, known as Syria and Phoenicia, the area was left in much its previous state, with considerable power and authority in the hands of the native chieftains. More is known of taxation than of administration.